The rangers call it the smoke, that heavy blue-gray fog that settles over the Tennessee peaks without warning. Caleb didn't think much of it at first. He just wanted to tie his bootlace. He knelt down on the damp earth, the sound of Julianne's humming still drifting behind him. It took 10 seconds, maybe 15. When he stood up and turned around, the humming had stopped. The path behind him was empty. There was no sound of running, no scream, no struggle. Just the swirling white mist and a silence so loud it felt like a physical weight. That was the moment Caleb's life ended, and his waiting began. The Great Smoky Mountains have a way of holding on to time. If you stand still long enough on the ridgeline, between the North Carolina and Tennessee border, you can almost feel the breathing of the forest. It is an ancient place, older than the bones of the continent, wrapped in a blanket of blue vapor that smells of pine needles, wet decay, and ozone. People come here to find peace. They come to escape the noise of the cities, to disconnect from the grid, and to reconnect with something primal. But sometimes, the mountains ask for a toll. Sometimes, the disconnection is permanent. Caleb and Julianne were not risk-takers. They were the kind of couple that double-checked the locks on their doors before leaving the house. They were the kind of people who researched trail maps for weeks before putting a boot on the ground. They had been married for 6 years, together for 10. And their love had settled into that comfortable, quiet rhythm that feels less like a spark and more like a hearth fire, warm, constant, and necessary for survival. They had chosen a trail near the Deep Creek area for their anniversary. It wasn't an incredibly difficult path, but it was secluded. Julianne was an artist, a watercolorist who found inspiration in the way light filtered through the dense canopy of hemlock and oak. She wanted to find a specific overlook she had read about in an old guidebook, a place where the valley opened up like a cupped hand to catch the morning sun. Caleb, ever the protector, carried the heavy pack. He had the water, the first aid kit, the extra layers, and the lunch they had packed together that morning in the rental cabin. The drive up to the trailhead had been perfect. The October air was crisp, biting at their cheeks when they rolled down the windows. The leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the mountains in strokes of burnt orange and deep crimson. They laughed about work, about the leak in their roof back home in Ohio, about the future they were planning. They talked about children. Julianne wanted a girl. Caleb just wanted everyone to be healthy. It was the kind of conversation you have when you think you have all the time in the world. They parked the car at 8 a.m. The lot was empty. It felt like they had the entire wilderness to themselves. As they started walking, the crunch of their boots on the gravel and dirt was the only sound competing with the wind. The air was fresh, filling their lungs with that sharp, clean oxygen that only exists at elevation. Julianne walked a few paces ahead, her camera swinging around her neck, stopping every few minutes to touch the moss on a rock or admire the twist of a rhododendron root. For the first 2 hours, it was paradise. The sun dappled through the leaves, creating moving patterns on the forest floor. They stopped for water by a small, trickling stream. Caleb remembers the way the light caught Julianne's hair, turning the stray strands into spun gold. He remembers the specific shade of blue of her jacket. He remembers the taste of the apple they shared. These are the memories he would later catalog, archiving them in his mind like evidence in a case that would never go to trial. Around noon, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a cooling of the air, a dampness that seemed to rise from the soil rather than fall from the sky. The famous smoke of the mountains began to drift through the trees. At first it was atmospheric, romantic even. It softened the edges of the world, turning the sharp lines of the trees into ghostly silhouettes. But then it thickened. The birds, which had been chatting consistently all morning, suddenly went quiet. The wind died down. The forest held its breath. "We should probably head back," Caleb said, checking his watch. "This fog is getting thick." Julianne nodded, but she pointed to a ridge just 100 yards ahead. "Just up there," she said, her voice sounding strangely muffled by the mist. The guide said the overlook is right past that cluster of boulders. I just want to see it for a minute. Just one photo. Caleb hesitated. He was the cautious one, but he couldn't say no to her. Not when she looked so alive, so happy, okay, he said. 5 minutes, then we turned around. They walked toward the boulders. The trail here was narrow, lined with waist-high ferns. Caleb stopped to retie his left boot. The lace had been slipping all morning, a minor annoyance that would become the most regretted action of his life. Go ahead, he said, kneeling down. I'm right behind you. He heard her footsteps continue. Crunch, crunch. He focused on the knot, pulling it tight, double looping it so he wouldn't have to stop again. He was looking down for maybe 15 seconds, 20 at the most. He heard a rustle, like a branch snapping gently. Then silence. Not the quiet of a pause, but a total, absolute void of sound. Got it, Caleb said, standing up and brushing the dirt from his knee. Let's get that photo. He looked up. The trail ahead was empty. The mist had thickened rapidly, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet, but he should have still seen the blue of her jacket. Julianne, he called out. His voice sounded flat, swallowed instantly by the fog. He walked forward, faster now. He reached the cluster of boulders. There was no one there. The trail continued for another 50 yards before disappearing into a wall of white. Jules, stop playing. A prickle of unease started at the base of his neck. It wasn't panic yet. It was just confusion. She couldn't have gone far. There was nowhere to go. The terrain on the left was a steep incline. On the right, a drop-off into dense brush. He walked past the boulders. He spun in a circle. Julianne, he shouted louder this time. The silence that answered him was heavy. It was the silence of a room where a clock has just stopped ticking. He ran forward to the edge of the drop-off. He scanned the gray void. Julianne? He checked his phone. No signal. Of course no signal. He cupped his hands around his mouth and screamed her name until his throat felt raw. Minutes turned into 20. 20 turned into an hour. Caleb ran up and down that 100-yard stretch of trail, his movements becoming more erratic, more desperate. He looked for footprints. He looked for a piece of fabric. He looked for broken branches. There was nothing. It was as if she had simply evaporated. The panic set in like a cold vice around his chest. The logical part of his brain was trying to calculate speed and distance, telling him she must have slipped, she must be hurt, she couldn't just vanish. But the primitive part of his brain, the part that fears the dark and the unknown, was screaming that something was wrong. Fundamentally wrong. By 4 p.m., the light was failing. The fog had turned from white to a bruising purple. Caleb had to make the agonizing choice to leave the spot to get help. He ran down the trail, stumbling over roots, risking his own ankles, his breath coming in sobbing gasps. He reached the car just as the true dark settled in. He drove to the nearest ranger station like a madman, tires screeching on the winding mountain roads. The search began that night. Search and rescue teams are incredible people. Volunteers, professionals, dogs. They swarmed the woods with flashlights that cut through the dark like lightsabers. Caleb wanted to go back up, but they made him wait at the command center. He sat on a metal folding chair, shaking uncontrollably, wrapped in a shock blanket that offered no warmth. He watched the radio operators, listening to the static and the terse codes. Sector 4 clear. Nothing in the ravine. K9 unit lost the scent at the boulders. That was the phrase that broke him. Lost the scent. How does a scent just end? How does a human being made of flesh and bone and matter cease to exist in the physical plane? The sheriff explained it gently. The wind, the moisture, it messes with the dogs. But Caleb saw the look in the sheriff's eyes. It was a look of confusion. The search lasted for 10 days. They combed every inch of that mountain. They rappelled down the cliffs. They used thermal imaging drones. They found a candy wrapper from 1998. They found a deer carcass. They found nothing that belonged to Julianne. No camera, no jacket, no boot. The 11th day, the official search was suspended. It became a recovery mission, which is the polite way of saying they were no longer looking for a living woman. They were looking for a body. Caleb didn't leave. He stayed in a motel in Gatlinburg for 3 months. Every day he hiked back to that trail, walked past the boulders. He sat on the log where he had tied his shoe. He'd talked to her. He apologized. "I'm sorry I stopped," he would whisper to the trees. "I'm sorry I looked down. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." He replayed those 15 seconds in his mind a million times. If he had been 3 seconds faster, would she still be here? If he hadn't double-knotted the lace. The guilt was a parasite, eating him from the inside out. He eventually had to go back to Ohio. He had to work. Had to pay the mortgage on a house that felt like a museum. It didn't change anything. Her watercolor paints were still on the desk. The water in the jar evaporated, leaving a dry stain of pigment. Her shoes were by the door. Her smell began to fade from the pillows, and that was a second death. He started sleeping with her unwashed sweater wrapped around a pillow, terrified that one day he would forget the scent of her shampoo. Years passed. The seasons changed. Caleb aged. His hair turned gray. His face grew lined with the stress of a grief that had no closure. In a normal death, there is a body. There is a funeral. There is a plot of earth you can visit. But with a missing person, there is only the what if. Is she hurt? Is she walking somewhere looking for him? Did she hit her head and forget him? The not knowing is a torture that never ends. It is a sentence without a verdict. He kept her phone line active, paid the bill every month for 5 years just in case. Just in case she walked out of the woods and called him. He knew it was irrational. He knew the battery had died years ago. But cutting that line felt like cutting the last thread that tethered her to the world of the living. 5 years later, almost to the day, a group of off-trail hikers found something. They were miles away from where Julianne had vanished, in a deep, treacherous hollow that was almost inaccessible. It wasn't a body. It was a backpack. It was weathered, chewed by animals, covered in moss, but it was blue. The rangers called Caleb. He drove down through the night, his heart hammering a rhythm of terrified hope. When he walked into the station, the ranger placed a plastic bag on the table. Inside was the backpack. And inside the backpack, wrapped in 3 layers of plastic Ziploc bags, was a sketchbook. The moisture had ruined the edges, and mold had eaten some of the pages, but the center was preserved. Caleb put on gloves, his hands trembling so hard he could barely turn the paper. There were sketches of the cabin, sketches of the car, and on the very last used page there was a drawing. It was a sketch of a man kneeling on a trail, tying his boot. It was him. The drawing was detailed. It captured the curve of his back, the way his hair fell over his forehead, but the perspective was from above, high above, as if she had been looking down at him from the trees or from the sky. At the bottom of the page, in her handwriting, slightly shaky but unmistakable, were 3 words. Don't wait up. There were no remains ever found. The backpack was the only thing the mountain gave back. Caleb is an old man now. He still goes to the Smokies every October. He doesn't hike the trail anymore. His knees can't take the elevation. But he drives to the overlook, the one they never reached together, and he sits there for hours. He watches the mist roll in, that heavy blue-gray smoke that swallows the world. He doesn't call out her name anymore. He knows she isn't lost. She didn't wander off. The mountain simply took her. It saw something in her spirit that matched the wildness of the woods, and it claimed her. He sits on the hood of his car, watching the sun dip below the jagged horizon, casting long shadows across the valley. He thinks about the sketch. Don't wait up. He knows it was her way of setting him free, her way of telling him that she had crossed a threshold he couldn't follow. But love, true love, doesn't obey commands, doesn't listen to logic or death or time. So he waits. He waits until the first star appears, a lonely pinprick of light in the vast, dark canopy. He whispers, "Happy anniversary, Jules," to the silence. Sometimes, just as the wind picks up and rattles the dry leaves of the oaks, he imagines he hears a humming, soft, melodic tune, drifting from the deep woods, reminding him that nothing is ever truly gone in these mountains. It just changes form. The mist rises, the mist falls, and the love remains, echoing in the quiet spaces between the trees, waiting for the day when he can finally finish the hike.